If I were to ask you, do you think you're happy? Your first impulse would be to examine your feeling states. How do I feel? Or how do I feel about myself over a long period of time? Or this time of my life? Or you would look at yourself. If you go back, we're going to go back on a timeline. Because we're Catholics, we have a history. Because we're Catholics, we can study the important issues of our faith using history, literature, philosophy, politics, the sciences, art, theology, and of course everything rooted in Scripture and in the magisterium of the Church. Because we're Catholics, we're not, as Father said last night, anti-intellectuals. When I became a Catholic nearly 20 years ago, the biggest reason I left the Southern Baptist Church, where I was a minister, was I got tired of the nonsense that people would throw me when I said I was reading Plato or reading the novels of Tolstoy or watching the films of Ingmar Bergman or listening to the music of Mahler or going to the museum to see Renoir or going to the ballet to see Edward Villila dance a Balanchine ballet. I got tired of it because I knew that God had created the world, God had created human hands to make beautiful things, and that beauty and truth, goodness, all belonged to God, wherever it was found. And there was no reason to demarcate between that which is Christian because it's in Scripture and that which is Christian because it's in the world. So what we're doing for you at this School of Theology, it's not for intellectuals. Will everyone who's not an intellectual please leave the room? I mean, nobody be left, right, except for Father Shaw. I mean, I'm from Texas. I can't be an intellectual. This is for you. No matter whether you graduated from high school or college, whether you read Greek or Latin or barely read English, what we're doing is for you. Why? Because we're talking about something that all of you have to do. You have to live. There's one thing that you didn't choose to live. You didn't choose that. As Jean Paul Sartre, the existentialist philosopher, would say, you got stuck with that. You were thrust into the world by forces out of your own control. And so here we are, all of us, trying to live. How do we live? How do we guide our conduct? What are our standards? What are our norms? What's the bottom line? What's, as it's been called, the moral compass? The word that comes up over and over again, even now, even though the word has gone bankrupt, is happiness. People say, I'm going to get married because I'll be happy. We'll be happy. And then 7 years later, we're going to get divorced because we'll be happy. We're going to have 2 children because we'll be happy. We're going to have 8 because we'll be happy. I'm going to become a Catholic because I'll be happy. I'm going to become a pagan because I'll be happy. I'm going to gain weight, lose weight, dye my hair, shave my beard, grow a beard. Whatever your choice is. Because why do we use the word happy? Because nobody is supposed to take issue with it. If you say hunting elk on a snowy mountainside, risking avalanche makes you happy? Am I supposed to say, no, it doesn't? I mean, what happens when you say to somebody, no, that doesn't make you happy? They go, who are you to say that? Who are you to tell me what makes me happy? Because that claim is supposed to stop all discussion. It's supposed to end debate. In fact, it ends debate. It closes you out from discussing my life. If I say, this makes me happy, you have no right to intrude on that statement. So happiness is a way, or claiming happiness, is a way of privatizing your life. Making sure nobody else gets access. Because you are the only expert on your happiness. Why? Because if happiness is a feeling, if it's some feeling state floating around in your self-conscious psyche, then can anybody else inspect that? Can anybody else go through the little window of your eyes and tell you, no, I don't see happiness in there? No, they can't. Because you're the only one supposedly looking in there. Inspecting yourself. And so you can claim a happiness that no one else can contradict. Pretty powerful. Think about it. It reduces all moral judgments to whatever you want to say. It reduces all moral justifications for anything you want to do to something nobody can contradict. Except maybe your shrink. And that's why shrinks have become the high priests and priestesses of our day. Because they're the ones that deal with these things. This is why this School of Theology, all the lectures we're giving, this discussion of happiness, in spite of the big words, it's for you. I'm sad, and I taught philosophy for 15 years, and I never had more fun in my life than when I was a teacher. Now I'm in Washington, being accused of being a right-wing extremist. Yesterday, in the Boston Globe, I was compared with Osama bin Laden. Ellen Goodman, the columnist, writes, for D.L. Hudson to define Catholicism is like Osama defining Islam. So for me, if I didn't know a little bit about why I'm doing what I'm doing, I could feel pretty ground up and spat out a lot of the time. But all of us have those crosses to bear. All of you. All of you know suffering. All of you know death. All of you know betrayal and loss. And the problem with trying to live a happy life is that it looks on the outside like suffering, pain, death, and betrayal can't belong to a happy life. Why? So what do? You start denying suffering, pain, death, and betrayal because you know what? You don't want to miss happiness. You don't want to not be able to claim that you're happy. I mean, that's why happiness leads to such self-deception. Are most liable to lie about. Because who wants to say, no, I'm unhappy? I'm an unhappy person. Become a character out of a Dostoevsky novel. Now, so this is for you. So for the next 5 days, bear with me. Bear with me. Bear with all of us. We're trying to make simple thought simple. Not difficult thought easy. Mortimer Adler used to always get mad when he was called a simplifier. No, he didn't have to simplify anything, because these ideas are not that difficult. Even though they were written in Greek and Latin, they're not that difficult. Now, I want to tell a story. Torture. History of torture is very interesting. A tyrant back in the about 3rd or 4th century BC was named Phalaris. That was his name. I believed he lived in Italy, if not in Sicily. I think Sicily. And he used to torture his political rivals by putting them in this metallic, hollow bowl. Now, you Wyoming folks should relate to that. It's a bowl, and it's hollow. It's an animal. And he would put this metallic bowl over an open fire until it was red hot. And he would put his victim in there. And the victim would gradually roast alive. But in the course of roasting alive, would start screaming. And the sounds of the screaming victim would sound like a bull. And so you had the bull of Phalaris became well known throughout the ancient world. Socrates and Plato posed a problem or a question that was debated all the way into the 18th century. Whether someone could be called happy who was in the bull of Phalaris. Think about it. If you saw or heard someone being roasted alive, would it even occur to you to raise the question about whether or not he or she was happy? No. Why not? Because we've gotten so used to happiness being Robert Schuller, power of positive thinking, beatitudes. You know, that nobody's really reached the pinnacle of life unless they have a permanent Jesus smile planted on their face. When I see a Jesus smile, I run the other way. I know, I hold on to my wallet. And y'all know what I'm talking about. Give me somebody with a little bit of healthy sadness, because they're going to be real. We've gotten so used to the mantra of positive thinking, so used to the end of life. Just think, at the end of life, the pinnacle, the best life, being defined and portrayed in terms of feeling good all the time, having self-esteem, that we want to drive suffering and pain, sadness and grief out of our lives. Why? They don't fit in a happy life. But yet the ancients, the medievals, the greatest thinkers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment thought it was an important question. Could someone be called happy while under torture? In the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas, he asked the question, could Jesus Christ have been happy while being crucified on the cross? I was fortunate enough 2 weeks ago to be invited by Mel Gibson to see his film, The Passion, at a showing in Washington, D.C. Went out the night before and played pool with Mel. Beat him 4 out of 6 games. enjoyed watching all the women in the pool hall gradually gravitate over to my pool table. But to this movie, I predict, will be the most powerful evangelical tool for Christianity since the papacy of John Paul II. This is an amazing movie, a great work of art, worthy to be compared to the greatest works of art you've ever seen or heard. I bring it up because once you've seen this movie, which is the last 12 hours of the Passion of Christ, which goes from the Garden of Gethsemane to the trials, to the scourging of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, you understand graphically, and in a way you'll never forget, how pain and suffering were at the heart of redemption and the heart of our salvation. You'll never take the word scourging for granted again. Now, how was it possible to ask the question whether Jesus Christ could be happy on the cross or a torture victim be happy inside the bull of Phalaris? Because the word happiness, that eudaimonia word, was a judgment about whether a life was being lived well. Was a judgment about whether someone was a good person. Was a judgment about somebody's virtue. Not a judgment about how they felt about themselves. You know, can we all agree on one basic fact? A lot of really creepy people feel good about themselves. You know, a lot of really dangerous people feel good about themselves. In fact, that's why they're so dangerous. Because they can hurt you and hurt themselves and feel really good about it. So why the heck are we promoting that in this culture? Why? Why are we creating monsters, moral monsters, by promoting a form of happiness that allows you to be totally inscrutable to others, to privatize all value, and to allow yourself to wallpaper over all the evil you may do because you feel good about it. I remember the heyday of Shirley MacLaine when she was channeling, you know, a 5,000-year-old goddess. I remember her being interviewed, and someone asked her about, do you regret anything in your life? Oh, regret is negative energy. There's no need to regret anything. I wouldn't want to be in the same room with someone who wasn't capable of regret. Because someone who's not capable of regret is really dangerous. Because that means they have eliminated their conscience. Regret is what helps us to reform our lives. It's what helps us to ask for forgiveness, to go to confession, to do penance. Take regret out, take that negative energy out of your life, and what have you got? You've got someone who will never admit making a mistake. Someone who never converts. Someone who never is penitential. You see, in the ancient world and the medieval world, Renaissance world, we're going to put a timeline up in a second. To be called happy was the best thing that could be said about you. Why? Because someone is saying about you that you're living the best life a human being can live. That you're in the upper category of how well a person can live. It wasn't a judgment about how you felt about yourself, because the happiness judgment, or the judgment about whether a person's happy was always made by somebody else. You didn't make it about yourself. In fact, when you go back and read all these books, and I loved reading them. I loved reading Cicero. I mean, Cicero is fabulous. Very conversational. It's like sitting in a chair, smoking a pipe, talking to you. There's a lot of it in Augustine. It's all over the place. If you read the founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, they're all talking about happiness. That's the way they were educated. That's why it made it into a Declaration of Independence, which we're going to talk about later. But they were never asking people, do you think you're happy? Do you think you're happy? They were asking these people to say, do you think she's happy? Or do you think he's happy? It was a third-person judgment, not a first-person judgment. Why? Because it was a judgment about what could be observed, not what is secreted away in some private compartment of self-consciousness, something only available to you. But it was something you could see about how a person acts, how a person behaves, how a person speaks, treats others, treats the state, treats the poor, treats his work, treats his family. Can you call that person happy? Aristotle would say, it's not safe to call somebody happy until they're dead. Because you can always lose your happiness. You can always blow it. Or even Aristotle would say you can lose happiness after you're dead, if your kids blow it for you. Now, someone made a very good recommendation at breakfast, and that is, give us some historical perspective, some timeline. So what I want to put on the board here is just a very 5-minute history of the idea of happiness. In my first year as a college professor, in 1980, I made $10,000. After 15 years, I was making $48,000 at Fordham before I left. But what kept me going, in spite of being impoverished, making $48,000 and living in New York City was not easy. Thank God for my parents. Was the fact that I could read all these great books. And the fact that my life was a commitment to understanding the most important things in life. That's a privilege. It's a great thing to be a teacher. And it's sad that teaching gets so little respect and is valued so poorly. The reason it doesn't get respect is because they don't make any money. Well, I'll tell you what, I'd rather be Bob there when he's 75 than I would somebody who spent all their life not learning how to enjoy themselves and enjoy conversation and enjoy reading and enjoy thinking about existence. He'll never be bored. He may bore others, but he'll never be bored. Now, the history of happiness begins with the pre-philosophical world, the world of polytheistic religion, the world of the Hebrews, monotheistic religion, animism, and so forth. And the idea of happiness, and say prior to the beginning of Greek philosophy in 600 BC. That's when we begin to see philosophy emerge on the western coast of Asia Minor. But prior to that, happiness meant luck. It meant fortune. So you have the pre-philosophical world, and happiness means luck or fortune. Your happiness is determined by forces outside of you. O fortuna. You've ever heard Karl Orff's great Carmina Burana, the first opening chorus is O fortuna. It's a hymn to fortune. With the arrival of philosophy, with Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, you have a debate about whether or not you want to call a person happy based upon what happens outside of them, based upon what happens to them, based upon what they're passive to. Shouldn't a person be judged not by what happens to them, but by what they do? And so Plato and Socrates, and prior to a few other figures, introduced the notion of virtue. A person is not judged by what happens to them, even if God does it. Because in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the idea of luck or fortune is identified with God's gratuitous love. But still, that's something that happens to you. And from a Greek philosophical perspective, even though Aristotle will include some of that, it's what you do. Now, virtue, by the way, virtue is not a fancy word. Virtue is just a word for good habits. That's all it is. Virtues are good habits. Habits that benefit your life, that make you live life well. And they could be habits of the body, habits of the mind, habits of reasoning, habits of doing, different kind of habits. So when you say virtue, don't let that word throw you. Habits. And of course, vices are habits too. They're bad habits. And we'll talk about vices later. I'm really good at the vices. But in the philosophical debate, now this starts at 600 BC, and the philosophical debate goes for approximately 1,000 years to about 400 AD. And so it encompasses Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers. And what the later philosophers add to the debate on virtue is the idea of different sets of good things in life. You have the goods of the body. Does a person need physical health? Does a person need, we're in a camp for the blind. Can a person be blind and be called happy? You have goods of fortune, and that's how the idea of fortune remains part of the debate. In other words, can a person be called happy if their friends suddenly die in a shipwreck? You have goods of the mind. And so you have different kind of goods. Goods of the body, goods of fortune, goods of the mind, and external goods like wealth, toys. And so the debate becomes what things, what events, what things need to be intermixed with virtue in order for a person to be called happy. But the one thing I want you to remember is that no matter what philosopher chose what group of good things, if virtue wasn't there, no one could be called happy. Now, Aristotle would, for example, make the observation that you really couldn't call somebody happy until they had a certain amount of wealth. But wealth itself did not constitute happiness. You had to handle your wealth virtuously. Okay? When we get to the era called the patristic era, the era of the first great Christian theologians, which really, of course, overlaps with this because you have the first great Christian theologians emerging after the biblical period in approximately 100 AD, and the patristic era goes approximately up to 600, about 600 AD. We get to the early Middle Ages. You have the towering figure of Augustine and the then towering figure of Boethius, although he's not well known anymore, because his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, I believe, was either the second or third book that Gutenberg printed after the Bible, was translated by people like Queen Elizabeth out of Latin into English. But Augustine makes the move that you would expect any Christian to make. Because in the philosophical tradition, the aim or object of happiness was human perfection, the best life you could live. Call it the good life, the best life you could live. Augustine's going to say the obvious. Happiness doesn't come with a person becoming the best human being they can be, even though that's great. Happiness is going to come by uniting yourself with God. So that's got to be the primary objective of the best life. So both Augustine and Boethius, writing within about 100 or 150 years of each other, will say happiness is in God, meaning someone can be called happy insofar as they are united with God through love, through faith, through hope, through the theological virtues. Now you can see right away in the history of happiness how that creates a problem. What happens to this life? Because all these philosophers for 1,000 years had been debating how do you achieve the best human life possible? Is it virtue? And if it's virtue, what is it? Virtue plus wealth, virtue plus health, virtue plus friends, virtue plus fame and reputation, virtue plus philosophical contemplation, virtue plus political power, etc. What happens to life in this world? Well, both Augustine and Boethius will come to the conclusion that, well, Augustine, for example, will basically say there is no happiness in this world. Because anything in this world is so imperfect, and any unity we have with God in this world is so unfulfilled and so unsatisfied. And if you read any history of the French Revolution, you'll see a lot of attention paid to the idea of happiness. But what did they mean by happiness? They meant pleasure. They meant the pleasure of being able to exert one's will, the pleasure of not being under an authority, the pleasure of freedom. So you see this idea of the Renaissance of the importance of the human will, of action, of freedom from authority coming to fruition here in the Enlightenment. But the mistake that most people make when it comes to our founding documents, and you may have already read the chapter I gave you, we'll talk about it at length later, is thinking that this hedonistic idea of happiness, all hedonistic means pleasure idea. Hedonism is simply a word for pleasure, has eliminated the virtue element or the virtue component that was inserted into the idea of happiness during the Greeks and the Roman period. It was not eliminated. It was not eliminated. Even the search for pleasure is supposed to be governed by virtue. Supposed to be governed by virtue. So the American pursuit of happiness is not without its relationship to this tradition of eudaimonia, this tradition that happiness is a moral condition and not just a condition of feeling good. The real and total break with that tradition comes with two figures, one in the Enlightenment, Kant, Immanuel Kant, but especially with his disciple, the great psychoanalyst of the turn of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud in Vienna. Of all the works I read, none illustrated the emergence of a purely psychological view of happiness as starkly as did Sigmund Freud's book, Civilization and Its Discontents, which was written in 1900. Because in that book, he says, happiness is nothing other than pleasure. The fullest form, the purest form of happiness is an orgasm. Did I wake you up, class? And he said that, and that was his way of saying that all human beings, in fact, are motivated by happiness and by nothing else. And that means the happiness motive is only it's only related to the self. It's all love is self-love. All search for happiness is a search for self-gratification. So he came to the conclusion that the only way you can have civilization is if you limit that urge, if you limit the erotic drive. If you don't limit the erotic drive, all men will kill all other men in fighting over the women. That's what he called the Thanatos syndrome, which became, of course, the title of Walker Percy's great last novel. And so in the last century, what have we had? We'd have nothing but permutations of psychological happiness. We've had psychological permutations in different psychological schools. We'd have self-help books. We've had the ultimate sort of popularization of Freudianism in positive thinking and other self-help kind of gurus. And to me, it is no surprise and no accident that we have become a culture so dependent on drugs. I mean, if you really want to see the payoff for a century spent chasing after psychological happiness, you don't have to look just at varieties of hedonism or varieties of concupiscence. Look at the dependence on drugs. I mean, if all we live for, if the best form of life, the life that deserves to be called happy, is constituted by feeling good about yourself every day, then why not just pop a pill in the morning? Why have to work? Why have to go to seminars? You know, why spend any money on it except, get your prescription? Government will probably pay for it anyway, or the insurance company. In fact, it seems to me that if you could create a happiness pill, everybody would take it. Everybody would take it. Ask yourself, if I could hand you an inexpensive daily pill that ensured that every day, regardless of what happened to you or what happened in the world, would make you feel good, would you take it? That was quick. She said no. Now, I can't imagine, why wouldn't somebody want to be protected from all the suffering in the world, the soldiers dying in Iraq, the orphaned kids, the children starving, the people in pain, the people dying of cancer. Why wouldn't somebody want to be sheltered by that? I mean, after all, if you're sheltered from that, you won't do anything about it. That means you get off the hook twice. You not only have to avoid feeling bad about it, you can avoid doing anything about it, because the only people that are going to do anything about it are the people that are moved. You know, all those little commercials that come on TV that show the poor little kids, you know, with flies on their face, and they say, you know, adopt this child for $40 a month, $26.95 a month, kind of the cost of your daily newspaper. I mean, if you didn't grieve a little at the face of that child, if you had your happiness pill, say, oh, who cares? I'm feeling good today. Now, the novels of Walker Percy, Father Shaw mentioned him. The novels of Walker Percy, almost all of them are nothing else but a depiction in concrete terms of the very thing I'm talking about. Because in two of the novels, some doctors explicitly come up with a concoction that helps people to get to this state. In Thanatos syndrome, it's sodium-laden drinking water. Interesting thing happens to the people who start drinking this water. They don't become all peaceful and serene. They start doing really violent things. In fact, they become so violent that readers and fans of Walker Percy have actually criticized him for the brutality and a sexual brutality of the scenes in that last novel. I want to leave you with a final thought.
First of all,
every time you go to Mass, one of the last words in the Mass, and if not the last words, are, happy are those who are called to this supper. Happy are those who are called to this supper. Now, what does that mean?
By a man named Shakespeare who surely...
Does that mean you come tripping down the aisle? I mean, some music is so bad in some churches. I went to my niece's confirmation in San Antonio, Texas, and they played a tango for the Holy Saturday Night Communion. I got to tango down the aisle. I was happy being called to that supper.
Especially when she...
But isn't it kind of ironic and sad that notion of the word happiness would be united with the supper, with the redemptive, painful death of Christ? It can't mean that. Especially when you have the word called in there. We as Christians are called. We have a vocation. We have a vocation to run around with a Jesus smile all the time? Is that all we have to do? We don't have to bear his cross. We don't have to participate in his suffering. We don't have to make ourselves servants. Or we just called to be happy all the time. I mean, have you ever thought about as you walked the aisle at the Eucharist what that word meant? Happy are those who are called. Have you ever wondered as you walked away after getting communion, I'm not feeling any different. I guess I didn't do it right. Or what about when you're walking the aisle and you're really grieved over something, you're really sad? Have you ever thought, well, maybe I'm not supposed to be here because I'm not feeling happy. I'm not doing what those words say. I suggest if you think about it long enough, you realize it means something different. It means something like living a good life, a virtuous life, one devoted to God, to your fellow man, and yourself, and that happiness is in you, as Aquinas said. Happiness is in the one who is happy, but it's not in you in the way that anybody has talked about for 100 years. And so for the next four lectures, we're going to determine how happiness is in you, whether or not it can be in any way mixed with suffering or sadness or pain, and whether it can be taken away, whether it's vulnerable to misfortune. In other words, when bad things happen to you, does that take away your happiness? Thank you very much.